Up next, Gordon and I compare the Canon G1X Mark III and the Sony RX100 Mark V on the Camera Labs Photography Podcast. Hi, it's Doug Kay, and I'm here with Mr. Camera Labs, Gordon Lang. Hello, Gordon.
Hello, Doug. How are you?
I'm doing very well. It looks like you've got two cameras today. We're going to do a special video here comparing specifically the Canon G1X Mark III and the Sony RX100 Mark V because they have a lot of similarities, don't they?
They do, and a lot of differences too. These two are high-end compact cameras, so they are designed for people who demand a lot, but still want a camera that they can maybe squeeze in a pocket or squeeze in certainly a much smaller space than an interchangeable lens camera. They want something that could either stand alone by itself as a very capable product, or something that's going to accompany, like a higher-end body. And these two, I reckon, at the time we filmed this video, represent pretty much the state of the art, but in two very different approaches. So on my left here, I have the Canon PowerShot G1X Mark III, and on my right here, I have the Sony RX100 Mark V. Doug, before we go any further, how much do these cameras cost?
Okay, the G1X Mark III is $1,300 in the US, and the RX100 Mark V is $950. So there's a difference of $350 here. The Sony is quite a bit less expensive. And as you have mentioned to me before, when the Sony RX100 Mark V came out, we said, oh my gosh, $950. That's a lot of money for a little camera like that. But now, $350 more. Is it worth it?
Well, hopefully you'll be able to answer that at the end of this video. So the Canon makes the Sony look pretty affordable. I'm not going to use the word cheap. It's certainly not cheap, but it's still getting to those three figures, whereas this is still comfortably in the four figures. And the reason that the Canon is so expensive is that it has a larger sensor, an APS-C size sensor compared to the 1-inch sensor on the Sony. Now that means that the sensor in the Canon has got roughly 3 times the surface area. It should be game over from this point on in the video. The Canon should be far superior, but that's not always the case, because it's all very well having a great big sensor, but if you have a smaller sensor and you couple it with a brighter lens, well, that can change everything. So before we go into that, let's have a look at what actually they have in common. Why would you be considering these two cameras? Well, they both have almost identical 3 times optical zoom ranges. Both start at 24mm. The Sony ends at 70, the Canon at 72mm, essentially the same range. They both have built-in electronic viewfinders, both using OLED panels. They have stacks of manual control and customization. They both have screens that can face forward to do pieces to camera. So if you're into vlogging or just selfies. Are you into selfies, Doug? Are you a selfie shooter?
I am not. No,
I can imagine you every day, going, you know what, I think I'm gonna go for this angle, that one. No dangling off cliffs, though. Dangerous.
I don't do that.
Climbing buildings with one hand up. It's not right, is it? Both of these cameras. Now, one of the things that makes them pretty unique compared to other compact cameras is that both of these sensors have got phase detect autofocus. They do it in different ways. Sony's is embedded permanently on the sensor. Canon's uses their dual pixel CMOS AF technology, which allows the pixels to kind of change their status. But the bottom line is both of these cameras have got very confident autofocus for both stills and movies that can stop at pretty much the right point with very little, or in the right conditions, no hunting at all. So great autofocus. Both have Wi-Fi with NFC. So a lot in common here. And even though the Canon is more expensive, they're both really expensive compacts. So I'm going to say they're roughly in the same ballpark. So these are two that I know people will be considering. So let's look at those differences. Now, just looking at these two cameras, Doug, what is the most obvious physical difference between them?
Well, I think the RX100, even though the Canon looks small, the RX100 looks even smaller.
Yeah, it is. There is definitely a size difference here. Now, because I'm sort of wobbling them around, we're going to show a nice still photo that I took of them earlier next to each other. And it's pretty clear that the Sony is comfortably smaller in every dimension. I mean, because the viewfinder folds into the body, it's shorter, it's also thinner, it's narrower, it's lighter too. It's a third lighter. You're looking at about 400 grams for the Canon, about 300 for the Sony, and you do feel that difference. If you were to try and squeeze them into a pocket, the Canon, it's not going in your trouser pocket, this camera. Now, it's small, Don't get me wrong, it's way smaller than an EOS M5, an interchangeable lens camera, but it is big for a compact. So you're looking at cargo pants or a coat pocket or small bag. Whereas the Sony, it's certainly not the thinnest compact in the world. But now, Doug, you've got a Mark IV, haven't you? This is the Mark V. They've physically got the same body. What's the smallest pocket you've managed to squeeze it in?
Oh, it fits in my front trouser pocket.
Exactly. So it may have an unsightly bulge, but it does fit in. This Canon is not going to fit in your front trouser pocket unless it's absurdly roomy. Let's not even go there. So that may have answered the question for you straight away. You may need a camera that squeezes into a trouser or shirt pocket, in which case, goodbye Canon and hello Sony. However, there is so much more to consider. Still looking at the bodies, the Canon is weatherproof, whereas the Sony is not. And both of these cameras had the misfortune of being in the bottom of one of my bags when it received a splash of seawater that killed the Sony battery, although the Sony camera itself was fine. It just needed a new battery, but the Canon emerged unscathed from that terrible, terrible situation. I should say that I do normally take great care of my cameras, and I was running away from the wave at the time. It was just bigger than I anticipated. It was bigger than the ones that I'm normally used to. If we have a look at the cameras from above, you'll also notice, I'm going to hold them this way around because it's easier to see. Look at the size of the grip on that Canon compared to no grip at all on the Sony. This Sony is small, but there's nothing to hold on to on the front. It's got a completely smooth front surface and just this tiny little thumb rest on the rear to push your thumb against, whereas the Canon's got this beautiful, great big grip, a bigger, more pronounced thumb rest. It just feels better in your hands, It feels really, really comfortable and confident. And also, even little things like when you click the shutter release, it's just a fairly basic button on the Sony, but on the Canon, it's the same soft touch shutter release. I'm going to say that again, soft touch shutter release that you would find on one of their higher end cameras. So overall, the kind of experience, also more controls on it. Look, it's got a front control wheel as well as the lens ring and the rear thumb wheel here, and a dedicated exposure compensation dial. The Sony's got plenty of control, but not as much as the Canon. It's got that lens ring and it's got a rear wheel. So it's lacking the dedicated exposure compensation. It's lacking that finger dial as well. So Doug, what do you think you've held your Mark IV many times? Do you find it a comfortable camera to use?
Oh, very much. I think, let me point out what I think is the biggest difference. Now, I've never used that particular Canon, but this Sony has the pop-up electronic viewfinder. Now, that's good and bad. The good is that when I don't need it, it's not there. And this is one of the reasons that it fits in my pocket, is that it's a very low profile camera. The bad is that if I want to use the electronic viewfinder, I have to go to the trouble to pop it up and pull it out. And I think that's both an advantage and a disadvantage. If you are an EVF type person, then the Canon might be a better camera for you. But if the pocketability is more important, then perhaps the Sony, because that to me is that. And you mentioned the controls. The Sony has essentially minimal controls, but a lot of programmable buttons. And so you may have to program those buttons. You may have to dip into the menus a bit more often.
It's a very good point about the viewfinder. As you can see on the Canon, it's permanently available. It sits on top of the body, so it means that it has a viewfinder head, which is lacking on the Sony. It makes this camera much bigger, but it means that viewfinder is ready to go. In a second, you just put it up to your eye, the viewfinder sensor detects it and switches it on. So it's much faster to use. The actual image size and image resolution through the viewfinder is roughly the same. I compared them directly against each other. It's about the same magnification, same amount of detail. It's slightly smaller than you would get on a good interchangeable lens camera, but roughly the same resolution. I should say an additional thing, though, because of the really neat mechanism that Sony has, it means that there's no room on this viewfinder for an eye guard or for an eye shield, whereas the Canon does. If you hold the Canon up to your eye, you really are shielding it from stray sunlight, whereas I find any time that I use the Sony, I need to hold it with my index finger here pointing up so that I kind of shield this little gap between the camera and my eye. Do you find that? Are you a lefty or a righty eye shooter?
I'm a left eye shooter.
Same here. So, because that wouldn't work so well if you were using it on the right eye, but do you do that? Do you find that when you look through this camera that you shield it with your finger?
I do. It has the same problem.
So I'm not going completely mad.
No, just as mad as I am.
is that a consolation? It's all I can live with at the moment.
That's
It's
right.
all I can have.
So listen, while we're talking about the viewfinders, though, what about the differences in the rear LCDs?
Great. Nicely done. So
You like that segue?
I
Well
do.
done.
That
Huh?
was very good. You've done this before. So on the Sony, as you can see, the screen flips up and to face the subject there above the top. Now, of course, that's one of the reasons that the viewfinder folds back down again and why there isn't a hot shoe on it. It wants to keep that top surface completely clean. So you can use this as a vlogging camera. You can use it for selfies. It does face the subject. But that's the full articulation. It will go down as well. It will angle. Come on out. There it is. It'll angle down as well. But that's the full extent of it. Up by 180 degrees and down by, about 45. That is great for shooting at high and low angles, as long as you're shooting in the landscape orientation. As soon as you put it in the portrait orientation, having a screen that does that is not going to help you shoot at high or low angles. However, the Canon has a fully articulated side hinge screen, so that can face forward for your selfies or pieces to camera. But it also means that you can angle it like this, so I can shoot in the portrait orientation at low angles, or if I turn that around at high angles. And of course, it means that you can turn it back on itself for protection. So you're not going to scratch the screen inadvertently there when it's like that. So you get much greater flexibility with the Canon screen. But better still, it's also touch sensitive, which the Sony, unforgivably, after 5 generations of us moaning about this, it still is not touch sensitive. And I sincerely hope that with the Mark VI Sony, which has to come out in the next year, it will have a touch sensitive screen. Please, Sony, put a touch sensitive screen on it. It really needs it. And I'm confident it will, because they've started to put it on their interchangeable lens cameras now. Again, after we moaned, I think if you moaned for, enough already, just put on the screen and laying, and Kay won't whinge about it anymore. But what it does mean is that even though the Canon's got a lot of controls, you can tap your way through them. You can swipe through pictures and play back. Most importantly, you can tap to reposition the focusing area, and you can tap to pull focus in movies. You can also use the touch screen as a touchpad, which is kind of like having a joystick to move the AF area when you're composing with the viewfinder. And you can choose which part of the screen to use, and you can just kind of shift your thumb around the corner of that screen to move the AF area. It works really, really well. So big advantage. So Canon wins on the screen front. So, 10 points to them there, and 0 points for I'll give them 1 point for its semi-articulation. So does that tempt you more towards the Canon there, Doug?
For me personally, I love having the pocket ability. What I've said on many of our shows, I refer to this as my 24-70 in a pocket. When I'm traveling in particular, this camera comes with me. I go out to dinner. I don't want to take a camera bag. I don't want to take a camera over my shoulder or around my neck. I want my hands completely free, my shoulders completely free. This wins for me.
You could have cargo pants or giant clown pants, and then this would still fit in your pocket.
I've told that for people my age, cargo pants are not allowed.
I think that's probably wise. So yes, that is an issue. That's definitely an issue. So I've got to tell you more things about this Canon to turn you onto it then. Okay, have a look at the top surfaces of these. Look, you will notice that the Canon has a hot shoe, which the Sony doesn't. You can mount a flash gun, a proper Canon Speedlight flash gun on this, and it becomes very ungainly, but it works. You could do functions with this. How about that? Does that tempt you, being able to do that?
Well, the flash probably is larger and weighs more than the camera.
It does. And I did it with the old 320EX, which is, I think, a discontinued model, which is certainly not a 500 or 600 series Canon flash. And it was like, whoa, it felt really weird, even with its big grip. But it worked. It worked. No, that doesn't do it for you. How about mounting an external microphone and using hang on a minute. It doesn't have a mic input, and neither of these cameras do. Now, they have fairly decent built-in microphones, and if you're using them for vlogging and you're holding it, say, at arm's length, both of them will record pretty good audio. It's better than you might think, and you could, of course, use an external sound recorder if you really want to have an external mic. But it's such a shame that Canon went to the effort of putting a hot shoe on the G1X Mark III and, only using it for flashes. Yeah, you could mount a light on it, I guess. But I want to mount a hot shoe on it. Sorry, hot shoe. I want to mount a microphone on it, especially as the screen flips out to the side. This camera's built for it. Surely. Sadly not. So I can't say that this has that connectivity and that Sony doesn't. So time to move on, I think. And this is the point where we've really got to compare the lenses and the sensors at the same time, because as I hinted at the beginning of this video, the Canon has a big sensor, but the Sony has a bright lens. And in many situations, these will actually kind of compensate for each other, and you'll end up with a remarkably similar result for some things. Not for all things, but for some things. So let's have a look at this. The Canon has an APS-C sensor. The Sony has a 1-inch sensor, and as I mentioned earlier, that means the Canon sensor has got 3 times the surface area, which is a lot, a big difference, but also makes it expensive. The Canon has 24 megapixels compared to 20 on the Sony. Now, first difference here, 4 megapixels at that point ain't going to make a great deal of difference to real-life resolution, so I'm going to just discount that straight away. Okay, let's have a look at noise levels. Now, I shot the same low light scene with these 2 cameras, and you can see that full rundown in JPEG and RAW at cameralabs.com. But here's the bottom line. Here's the TLDR. They were actually remarkably similar, even at the same ISOs. Now, I was about to make the excuse that, yes, the Canon is superior at the same ISO, but you don't need to worry about that because you won't be using the same ISO because of the bright lens on the Sony. But in fact, they were actually very, very similar at the same ISO, up to about 3200 ISO. Beyond that, the Canon began to have a bit of a visible advantage, but really below that, very, very similar. I was quite surprised by that. But even then, you will be able to deploy lower ISOs on the Sony because it has a brighter lens. It's f2.8 on the Canon at the wide end. It's f1.8 at the wide end on the Sony. That's over a stop faster. So when the Canon's at 400 ISO, you could be at 200 on the Sony. Zoom them both into the 70 millimeter end, and it becomes even more obvious. The Canon is at f5.6. The Sony is at f2.8. That's 2 stops difference. So when the Canon is at 800 ISO, the Sony could be at 200. And that is going to make a difference, especially if you say comparing 3200 on the Sony against 800. Sorry, 3200 on the Canon compared to 800 on the Sony. That is a big difference in quality. So, and also applies to video as well. If you're filming video, you're going to be able to do it at lower ISOs on the Sony. So in terms of that big sensor on the Canon, I'm still not seeing the benefit here. So let's have a look at depth of field. Now I'm going to show you a picture here. This is a portrait shot that I took with the Canon on the left and the Sony on the right. Both of them are fully zoomed in, so roughly the same focal length, 72 millimeter. They're both at their maximum aperture, so f5.6 on the Canon, f2.8 on the Sony. But what you will notice just by looking at this picture, or these 2 pictures, is that the depth of field, the potential for blurring, is actually pretty much the same. So big sensor on the Canon, but slow lens. Small sensor on the Sony, but bright lens actually balances out roughly in terms of depth of field, certainly in a portrait scenario. Now, if we have a look at a macro scenario, the Sony could actually have a benefit because it can actually focus closer at wide angle. The Sony can focus down to 5 centimeters at wide angle compared to 10 on the Canon. So here is another comparison showing, again, the Canon on the left, the Sony on the right. Look how much closer the Sony has managed to get. That subject is much bigger, but in turn, look at the impact that's had on the blurring in the background. It's got a much shallower depth of field, as it would. It's a much closer focusing distance, coupled with that brighter lens. So that big sensor on the Canon, which you've paid so much for, actually doesn't really have a benefit for depth of field. So does that surprise you, Doug? Or as a genius mathematician and expert on focal ratios, you knew that was going to happen, didn't you?
Well, forget the math. It's certainly been my practical experience that the Sony with its 1-inch sensor does just fine in terms of shallow depth of field. So without the math, I can see why it would be pretty much the same or even better.
Yeah, now another question to ask is, what are they like optically? What's the quality like on these lenses? And again, actually quite similar. I found that the Sony was actually, on my samples that I tested, there could be some variance. The Sony was actually a little bit sharper optically at wide angle, but the Canon was a little bit sharper. This is in the corners, in the far corners at the telephoto end, but really one wasn't considerably more outstanding than the other in this regard. So I wouldn't make a decision based on that. They both also have built-in 3-stop ND filters, which is extremely useful for filming, so you can't differentiate them on that. But hey, Doug, I'm going to show you these cameras again, face on, and I want you to tell me what other obvious difference you can notice.
Well, I see the hump from the viewfinder. on the Canon,
Mm-hmm.
the controls.
Have a look at the lenses. Both these cameras are switched off at the moment.
Oh, okay. It's a question of whether one has the the electronic lens cap or not. Am I close?
Exactly
Am I
right.
close? Did I get it?
You got it spot on. So the fact is that because it's a sort of smaller lens system, the Sony, like most point and shoot compacts, has got a sliding electronic lens cover. If I switch this camera on, you'll see that lens cover just gets out of the way, and then when I switch it off, it comes back again. Whereas the Canon, because it is a bigger lens system, has a removable lens cap. Now, people always laugh when I say this, but I know you don't laugh at me, Doug. Well, not to my face. You know what I'm going to say. I'm going to sound like an old fart knocker here, but it does make a difference. So let's say I'm walking around with the lens protected. I want to walk around with the lens protected. Hey, look, there's something I want to take a picture of. Lens cap comes off. Where am I going to put this? I'm going to switch this on right now. I'm ready to take a picture. Right, I put it in my pocket. There we go. And switch that off again, and because I want to keep this protected. There we go. Now it's protected. All right, so compare that to this. Walking along with the Sony. Hey, there's something I want to take a picture of. Got it in my pocket. It's faster, isn't it?
It is.
There's evidence. There's evidence for you. Tell me your experience, because does the Ricoh GR2, does that have a sliding lens cover?
No, it has. It's fully electronic. Here's my Ricoh GR2.
Which is
same thing.
Which is unusual.
Right.
Yeah, that's an APS-C sensor, but a fixed lens now. But because I think we've had this conversation before. What's your feeling on removable lens caps on compact cameras?
For compact cameras, I think removable lens caps are horrible because just as you demonstrated, what do you do with it? You don't. If you have a string, some people put a string holding their lens cap onto their camera body. That's okay. But again, the idea of being able to take the RX100 in a pocket, not even have to think about the lens cap, and it's, as you demonstrated, it's about a 1 second startup time. It's really not objectionable.
Yeah, and actually having it dangling, the lens cap dangling off on a string, is a disaster if you're filming video, because you will hear it swaying against it or knocking against it if it's windy, and that's not a good thing, not a good situation if you're going to be using it for video as well. So we've talked about it when we've reviewed the Fujifilm compacts as well, the big compacts, the X70 and X100 series. It's frustrating to have a removable lens cap, I think. Let me know what you think. Some people think I dwell on it. I shouldn't dwell on it, but it is an issue for me. So as you can see, there's quite a few similarities here. Big sensor slow lens, small sensor fast lens. It actually balances out in a lot of things. Do not expect a big difference between these cameras in terms of noise levels, even at the same ISO. Do not expect a big difference in terms of potential for blurring, for shallow depth of field. There is not a big difference. Do not expect one to give you a broader focal range than the other. They both have roughly the same coverage. So wait a minute, what exactly is the benefit of having and paying for this big APS-C sensor in the Canon compared to the 1-inch sensor in the Sony? Well, you got to look for it, and you will see it in terms of dynamic range. Now, the pixels, even though there's a few more of them on this sensor is way, way, way bigger surface area-wise. So the pixels are bigger, and you notice it in situations where you have a very wide dynamic range. So, in fact, you're not going to really see the benefit of this bigger sensor because of the lens in low light. You're going to see the benefit in very bright light. I noticed it in particular when I was filming video or shooting stills where there was very stark sunlight, say, illuminating one portion of the frame but not another. And I know as a street shooter, Doug, for you, it's a good street shooter's trick, isn't it? Is where you have like a shadowy street and then a beam of sunlight comes through and you wait for somebody to walk through it, right? And as soon as they hit the moment, you take the picture. It's beautiful composition. But if you were to do that with the Canon, its bigger sensor with its larger dynamic range, you will get detail, say, on the face when it's brightly lit against a dark background. Whereas I noticed on the Sony and other 1-inch sensor compacts, you're going to see a lot less of that. There's a much greater chance of those highlights being washed out, being clipped. And that is where I noticed it. And when you begin to look for that, you also notice that the colors are kind of more saturated on the Canon, and also its image processing, because the RX100 Mark V is not Sony's latest image processor. They've got a lot better at it recently. Models like the A9 and the A7R Mark III are much better. And I hope to see improved processing on the replacement for this whenever, if that comes. But in the meantime, the JPEGs out of camera and the footage out of camera on the Canon looks nicer to me. And I've got tons of sample images taken with both cameras in my full reviews at cameralabs.com. So check them out. They're full resolution. Download them and see what I'm talking about. I also have a vlogging video that I filmed with both of these cameras, and you can really see that difference in dynamic range there. So, Doug, does that sell it for you? Do you think, yeah, do you know what? I want that bigger sensor now?
No. I mean, I'm looking at it. I'm thinking about it as you're wrapping this up. I'm thinking, okay, what do I get? The sensor size doesn't matter. Wow, that hot shoe. I really need that hot shoe. No, I don't.
Weatherproofing?
Weatherproofing? No, it's gonna live in my pocket. I don't need the weatherproofing. If it gets,
it's not gonna live in your face. It doesn't fit in your pocket.
That one doesn't. Except for the cargo pants that I can only wear around the house.
I'm gonna buy you some for Christmas.
I'll tell you the one thing I like about the Canon. I like the fully articulating rear LCD. However, since it doesn't shoot 4K video, that sort of loses that advantage for me too. So
well, let's move on to that with another one of your expert segs there. Video. The Sony can film 4K at 30p. The Canon's best quality video, it's a Canon, right? So it's limited to 1080p up to 60p. So hey, the Sony wins, right? Kind of, but there's more to it than that, because when you film 4K on this RX100, because it's a small body and they're worried about overheating, you can only record 5 minutes worth of 4K. You can record half an hour at 1080, but only 5 minutes at 4K. Now, interestingly, the Canon, I'd like to say, hey, the Canon can film 1080 60p for half an hour, but it can't. It has a limitation as well. It will only do 10 minutes at 50 or 60p. Hey, it's still twice as much as the Sony will do in 4K. It will do almost half an hour if you reduce it to 24, 25 or 30p. The limitation then becomes a 4 gigabyte file size, which for me reached at about 25 minutes. So it still won't quite do half an hour, but still. So there is a little limitation there. Now, the interesting thing is, and you'll see this in my vlogging comparison with these two cameras, is that in fact, let's just show a little bit of that video now. Here's me vlogging, holding the G1X Mark III out as I walk along, and you'll notice that the stabilization is pretty darn good. This is because I'm using not just optical stabilization, but the additional digital stabilization. This crops the frame a little bit, but it does, by gum, it keeps it steady. And that means that I can walk along with it and it looks fine. Now let's switch over to the Sony RX100 Mark V. Now, this is filmed in 4K where you can only have optical stabilization. You can see that as I walk, it's a lot more wobbly. So yes, it's filming at a higher resolution, but you're not seeing the benefit of that unless you can keep that camera stable. Now, if you're filming from a tripod, great. If you've got a gimbal, great. But if you're walking with it, as I am here, the 4K is not that usable on the Sony. Now, the Sony can also switch down to 1080p, and at which point it will offer greater stabilization, roughly equivalent to the Canon. So you can kind of match that Canon stabilization. But what I'm trying to illustrate here is that when you're filming with 4K on the Sony, the stabilization is going to be restricted. You're also restricted to 5-minute recording times. It might not be that different. It might not give you the benefits that you're looking for. Have I put you off yet?
No.
Doug?
No.
All right, let me move on.
I'm still enthused.
So it's still 4K anyway. That's very nice that this camera has it, and it's very frustrating that the Canon doesn't have it. I feel that I'm pitching for the Canon here, and it's not. I'm totally unbiased. I love both of these cameras. I've shot with them both loads, and I'd be very happy with either of them. I'm just really pointing out lots of the differences here. Sony's got a real advantage when it comes to continuous shooting. Now, the Canon can shoot at 7 frames per second with continuous AF. The Sony can shoot at 24 frames per second. And the Canon has got, I don't know off the top of my head, but there is a limited buffer size to it. It will stop. The Sony just keeps going. Yeah, there is a limitation, but it just keeps going and going and going and shooting at an almost video frame rate. With continuous autofocus, it also has a 32,000th of a second electronic shutter with this anti-distortion technology. So there's little electronic skewing to worry about. The Canon peaks at 2,000th of a second. There is no electronic shutter on the Canon for stills. Now, it's got a leaf shutter, so it's quiet anyway. It's not as if it makes a giant sound. It's, the Sony can operate in silence, which technically the Canon can't. But really, leaf shutters are super quiet, so I wouldn't worry about that. But the fact is the Sony will if you want it. Going back to video, the Sony has got 1080p at 120 frames per second, so you can do slow motion with it. The Canon, as we know, stops at 60p. The Sony, if you're willing to reduce that video quality, will shoot at 240, 480 or 960 frames per second. It will do. Now, 960 looks pretty ropey, but it's 960 frames per second. So if you're into slow motion, special effects, the Sony is dead sexy for that. But here's where the Canon fights back. Both of them have got Wi-Fi, NFC, but the Canon has Bluetooth. Now, the replacement for this Sony in the future will almost certainly have Bluetooth. So this will become moot as soon as, if there is a Mark VI. But in the meantime, the Canon has Bluetooth, which the Sony doesn't. That means that it can maintain a low power connection with your smartphone. It can automatically embed GPS coordinates on your images as you shoot. That is such a pain in the bum to do on the Sony. You can do it, but I've detailed how to do it in my review, and you won't be doing it, basically. It allows it to implement a really simple cable release app, which doesn't even need Wi-Fi. It's very responsive, works really, really well. The Sony doesn't let you do that. But once you get into the Wi-Fi, once they are connected over Wi-Fi, capabilities are fairly similar. You can fully operate both cameras with your phone. You can transfer images and everything. So I think I've covered that. I did just want to go back to the video, because the Sony also offers, I think, an S-Log profile or flatter profiles for video than the Canon does, which in turn may make you think, oh, it's great, I'll be able to grade them. But again, dynamic range, the bigger sensor of the Canon is still going to win out over a flat profile with a little sensor. So I think I have covered everything that I want to cover, Doug. Now let's hear which one you would buy, Doug K.
Well, I started this review with an open mind. I really did. Now, to be fair, I have never had a G1X Mark III in my hand, so it's not quite the same. However, given the fact that I really like pocketable cameras and that I can save $350 by buying the Sony, that's where I would put my money. I just don't see enough compelling in the Canon to justify the extra $350 and giving up my pants pocket.
Giving up your pants pocket. Do you know what? I'm gonna go. I would be happy with either camera. They're both really, really nice, but I think I would go with the Canon for its increased dynamic range, for its fully articulated and touch-sensitive screen, for the Bluetooth, for the GPS location logging, for the weatherproof body, which I have put to the test, and its nicer controls. I'm willing to pay the extra and carry around a slightly bigger camera for that. But if Sony put a touch screen and a microphone input on the next generation of this, then I would find it very hard to walk away from that.
Oh, good. Two very different perspectives. I think that's good. That's why we're both here.
Exactly right. Two for the price of one.
I knew there was a reason we included you in these things. There might. All right, Gordon, hey, this has been great. I want to encourage everybody, if you're interested in these cameras, go to cameralabs.com, click on the buy link now. You can also buy us cups of coffee there, which, as you can tell, I desperately need, because we record these shows when it's very early in the U.S. and middle of the afternoon or late afternoon in the U.K. So please help me buy us some coffee. If you're interested in this, also please like us on YouTube or iTunes. Give us some comments. Tell us what you think.
Please subscribe. And again, if you are going to treat us to a coffee, we even have a link on YouTube in the comments section there. So everything you need to support us if you want to do that, we really do appreciate that. And again, the full reviews at cameralabs.com. Go to dougk.com if you want to find out what this fine fellow here on the other side of the ocean is up to. Maybe something fun near you soon.
You never know. Gordon, thanks a lot. We'll see you next time on the Camera Labs Photography Podcast. Bye-bye.